Is a Baltic cruise itinerary a good one for you? A European cruise is at the top of many cruisers' bucket list, but while the Mediterranean itinerary is the most popular, another great option people often don't think about is a Baltic cruise. Cruising to the Baltic region of Europe offers a unique experience and allows travelers to explore diverse cultures, enjoy temperate weather, and avoid the crowds typically that you get on Mediterranean sailings. I just got back from my own first ever Baltic cruise and I had an amazing time. So I want to share with you all that I learned about it. Now, first I want to note that if you're primarily familiar with Caribbean itineraries on your cruises, this is going to be a much different experience. So let's talk about a few of those differences. First and foremost, you are going to have to convert your currency. I've been to many Caribbean islands, pretty much all of them, and even if US dollars are not their currency, they do still accept US dollars. That is not the case in other countries, especially on a Baltic itinerary. Now, what makes a Baltic itinerary a little bit more confusing is they do have different currencies, which we'll talk about a little bit later. Now, on some cruises to the Caribbean, if you start and end at the same US departure port, you may not need a passport. If you're embarking on a Baltic cruise, you are going to need a passport. Interestingly enough, though, while we were advised to take our passport with us into the port on every single visit, never once was it checked upon embarking the ship after a port day. But of course, you have to have a passport if you're a US citizen embarking on a Baltic cruise. Now let's talk about some of the pros and cons of a Baltic cruise. First are the benefits. Number one is diversity in number of countries. One of the most significant advantages of a Baltic cruise is the opportunity to visit a whole bunch of countries in a single trip, which is great about cruising in general. On my first ever European cruise, which I said I just got back from the Baltic region, I visited Finland, Norway, Sweden, Denmark, the Netherlands, Germany, and Estonia, all in one cruise. And again, that's what I love about cruising. If it weren't for cruising, I never would have sought out Estonia as a destination, for example. To be completely honest, I have to admit that I wasn't even aware of Estonia as a country. But thanks to my Baltic cruise, I ended up visiting Estonia, and it ended up being one of my unexpected favorites. And again, I never on my own would have sought out a trip to Estonia. Each port on a Baltic destination, it offers a different flavor of Northern Europe, which makes your journey more exciting and more diverse and more educational. Number two, there are fewer crowds. Unlike Mediterranean cruises, Baltic cruises are much less crowded. And what this means is you can get out and explore cities and attractions without that overwhelming crush of tourists that you're going to find in some other European destinations, namely on Mediterranean sailings. So with a Baltic cruise, you can enjoy a much more relaxed pace, enjoy the sights without the hassle of those long lines and those crowded spaces, which I personally can't stand. The Mediterranean region, which encompasses popular destinations like Spain, France, Italy, Greece, and Turkey, that is one of the busiest cruise regions in the world. There are nearly 6 million passengers that sail on Mediterranean cruises each year, which, did you know this, makes it the second largest cruise market globally after, you guessed it, the Caribbean. The Mediterranean's popularity is driven by their diverse cultures, historic landmarks, and favorable weather conditions, which includes being very hot in the summer. And while growing in popularity, Baltic cruises, they pale in comparison in terms of numbers. They attract far fewer cruisers than the Mediterranean, with only about 1.1 million passengers annually. Now, I personally love that. I hate crowds, I hate lines, and I love that slower, laid-back vibe of the Baltic ports of call. And I found this particular itinerary to be surprisingly relaxing. I don't know if I would describe a Mediterranean cruise as relaxing. Third benefit of a Baltic itinerary is the temperate weather. The Baltic region does enjoy milder summer weather conditions compared to the scorching heat that you're often going to find on a Mediterranean sailing. So what this means is it's just so much more comfortable for sightseeing and for outdoor activities. Those cooler temperatures are perfect for getting out and exploring. You're not sweating, you don't have to worry so much about lathering up with sunscreen every day, and you don't have to run the risk of overheating. So it provides a much more pleasant and enjoyable experience. Mediterranean cruises are popular for their warm and sunny summer weather, which is perfect for beach activities, sightseeing, and enjoying the region's abundant outdoor cafes. But during the peak summer months of July and August, it gets really hot. Temperatures in the Mediterranean ports typically range from 70s to low 90s Fahrenheit. Includes destinations like Spain, Italy, Greece, and France, where you can expect consistently hot and dry conditions, which are ideal for those that love sun and heat. When it comes to exploring sites, walking around, not a beach day, I don't love sun and heat. So in contrast, Baltic cruises, that's more my speed. They offer a more temperate climate during the summer. The peak season from June to August sees about an average temperatures ranging from upper 60s to low 70s Fahrenheit. And the ports of call in the Baltic region, like those that I mentioned before, they experience much milder and more comfortable weather compared to the Mediterranean, with cooler temperatures and generally much less humidity. The climate is really favorable for getting out and exploring, enjoying yourself, and not having to deal with that intense heat. Another benefit of a Baltic itinerary is that it is so rich in history. Now, if you're a history enthusiast, you're gonna love this because the Baltic region is a treasure trove. From medieval castles to World War II sites, there is no shortage of historical landmarks to explore. The historical aspect of this part of the world is what I enjoyed most, and I particularly loved learning about the Viking heritage because nearly every single port of call we visited on our Baltic cruise was rich in Viking history, especially at our port stops in Stockholm and Copenhagen. Now, these cities feature museums and historic sites where visitors can explore the Vikings' legacy, from their maritime prowess to all the cultural and social influences across Northern Europe. I visited several Viking museums on my sailing, and I loved them all, and I learned so much. Drawbacks. Now, I love my Baltic cruise, but there are some downsides that you should be aware of before you consider booking one. This first one is probably the biggest, and that is the potential for boredom. For some travelers, the Baltic cruise itinerary may feel a lot less thrilling than a lot of other itinerary options. The focus here is on history and culture, and that might not appeal to everyone, especially those that seek a more adventurous experience and activities. They love beach days, or they love those big iconic landmarks. What you'll find with the Baltic itinerary is a lot of old churches, cobblestones, historic sites, and museums. I loved it. I will admit after 15, 16 days of it, it did start to get a little repetitive. These itineraries do tend to skew a little bit toward the older population, due in part to the locations that are visited, generally the higher cost and the longer sailing durations. I didn't mind being by far the youngest person on my cruise ship, but some people might. Another drawback of a Baltic cruise is the lack of those famous landmarks. Now, the Baltic region, don't get me wrong, it is super rich in history. As I mentioned, the Viking history is really, really cool. But this area doesn't boast as many of those iconic, worldwide landmarks as a lot of other parts of Europe. The sites that you're gonna find on a Baltic itinerary, they're usually not gonna be those bucket list landmarks. You're gonna find those on a Mediterranean sailing. So for example, you're not gonna find things like the Statue of David, the Leaning Tower of Pisa, things like that. So the lack of these huge landmarks could be a downside to those who really do enjoy visiting those world-renowned sites. The third is packing challenges. As I mentioned, the climate is varied. So packing for a Baltic cruise can be tricky due to that variable weather, and I'll talk about that more in a moment. It really is essential to dress in layers. I heard that advice, but I kind of didn't understand what it meant, but I'll talk about that in a moment. But you have to be prepared for cool and warm days, rain, dry, drizzle, everything. You have to have appropriate clothing for a lot of conditions. Now, it's kind of like packing for an Alaskan cruise. With the Baltic itinerary, it's kind of hard to pack light. Before we talk about packing, let's talk about currency and conversion. A lot of people want to know, do I need to convert currency for a Baltic cruise? While visiting so many diverse European countries in a compressed time is a huge benefit to a European sailing, including a Baltic sailing, managing currencies on a Baltic sailing, it can be a bit of a challenge. Because while most of the 40+ European countries use the euro as their currency, it might surprise you that many of the countries on a Baltic sailing, like Norway, Sweden, and Denmark, they do not. So to make matters more difficult, these three countries have their own separate independent currencies. So the idea of managing 5 different currencies on my itinerary, which would have required me to have US dollars, euro, Danish krone, Swedish krone, and Norwegian krone, it would have been a nightmare. So I personally chose not to go to the bank to convert into 4 other currencies in addition to United States dollars. So I decided to just convert some currency into euros. I did find that not all vendors in Norway, Sweden, and Denmark would accept euros, but what's almost universal in all European countries is contactless credit card payment. So I ended up using that almost exclusively, just using my international travel credit card. You do have to watch out, make sure you don't get hit with international transaction fees. I have specific cards that do not charge international transaction fees. So you don't have to worry about the struggle of managing, converting, and dealing with multiple different currencies. Now let's talk about how to pack and what you should wear on a Baltic cruise. Okay, confession time. I really struggled with this one, really. I kind of got it all wrong. I had checked average temperatures and weather for the days in the countries that were on my ports of call, but I was still taken aback by all the variances, which, as I noted earlier in the video, can be a downside of the Baltic itinerary. It seems like every single day I would get up, I would look at the weather forecast, I would get dressed thinking I knew what the weather was going to be like, only to exit my stateroom, go up to the Lido deck for breakfast, and find that it felt much hotter or cooler than I had anticipated. And I would look around and see that everyone's dressed differently than I was. For example, everyone's wearing shorts and short sleeves, and meanwhile I'm wearing jeans and a long sleeve shirt or sweater. So more than a few times I admittedly had to humbly go back to my stateroom to change clothes, and every single time I did, I was happy that I did. Conventional wisdom for any type of European travel says to dress in layers. And I cannot stress enough how true this is on a Baltic itinerary. I recommend that at most ports you wear a short sleeve shirt and a long sleeved outer layer or a jacket, but one that you can easily remove, maybe wrap around your waist if it gets warm because you don't want to have to get stuck lugging around a big coat. And unless it's a clearly warm, if not hot day, and the forecast calls for not much variance in temperatures, I would recommend wearing pants. A lot of times it would be cool in the morning, then hot in the afternoon, or hot in the morning, temperatures would drop. It was just all across the board. And an absolute must-have, a hooded jacket. I had packed with me several jackets, but I foolishly did not bring a single one that had a hood. And I regretted it deeply because on many of our ports of call, there was drizzle, if not outright downpours, and I was left unprotected. So then it was either get completely wet or lug around an umbrella, which is a bit of a hassle. I was pleasantly surprised though to find that Holland America Line did provide golf style umbrellas for cruisers to use for free in each of the staterooms. We ended up not using ours though, because again, as a golf style umbrella, it's very big and bulky. So maybe also bring a compact umbrella with you as well. One thing you absolutely should leave at home is any sort of shoe with any type of heel, even an itty bitty one. Most Baltic ports are scenic and historic, known for their gorgeous cobblestone streets, and while they're great to look at, what's not great is hobbling around on those cobblestone streets and having your feet ache because you wanted to wear some cute boots with a little heel, thinking that a small heel really wouldn't be a problem. Ask me how I know this. You also run the risk of legitimately rolling your ankle. Just don't do it. Leave the heels at home. To wrap up this video, I do want to leave you with one really important consideration, and this is really important. As I noted the pros and cons, there are lots of benefits to a Baltic itinerary. I talked about some of the downsides. The big downside though, it really can be boring. I'm really thankful that I did this cruise itinerary with my boyfriend because I promise you, if I had sailed with my children, we all would have had regrets. They would have been bored out of their mind. They would have been very tired of the churches, the cobblestone, the history. They're just not really into all of that. So if you're traveling with kids, unless your kids are little history buffs, I would find another itinerary. But otherwise, if you love history and you love culture and you want to see some countries that maybe you otherwise wouldn't get to, I cannot recommend a Baltic itinerary enough.